Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, How to Present Cybersecurity Risk to Senior Leadership. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speaker is James Tarala, SANS Senior Instructor. He will be moderating today's webcast. If during the webcast you have any questions for James, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. With that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to James.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is James Tarala from SANS. I want to welcome you here to the webcast this morning. We'll go ahead and I'll introduce myself a little, and then we'll go ahead and dive right in. Like Carol mentioned, my name is James Tarala. I'm one of the senior faculty members here at SANS. I've been working here with SANS for about 20 years, primarily in the area of risk, control development, and I spent a lot of my time in that time really working with organizations to try to help them understand where their cybersecurity risk exists and help communicate that to business leadership. And what we've seen over the last 20 years has been, frankly, a lot of problems, a lot of false starts, a lot of challenges, just clearly communicating the technical risk and the technical challenges that engineering teams are facing with senior business leadership. And this is one of those things that you don't get a lot of opportunities to really do well. If you do it well, you typically can continue, and you typically have an opportunity to sort of make this part of your career path. But a couple of false steps, and honestly, it's one of those areas where you can lose that opportunity very quickly if boards of directors, if senior leadership teams don't see immediate value in what you're presenting. So what we want to do today is start by laying out a framework for what it might look like to present this sort of risk to senior leadership and to take advantage of those opportunities that you might get, and hopefully bring some of our experiences in doing this with large organizations to what you can maybe do in yours as well. So the scope of what we're going to be doing here today is, in my career, I've had the opportunity of dealing with organizations all the way up to from the Fortune 50 to large government agencies to very, very small organizations. So I'll try to bring a diverse set of those experiences to the conversation today, so we're not just overly targeting maybe one group, but we'll try to share as many of those experiences as possible. I will warn you that in the next hour, we only have 1 hour, and what I would love to do is take this topic, frankly, and have you at my disposal for a week or so to really go through the topics of risk and really sort of go through what some of this means and give you some hands-on tools that you could bring back to your offices. But we'll try to give as much as we can, and we'll try to give you as many tips as we possibly can in this next hour, and hopefully you'll be able to bring these things back to your leadership teams to enhance the experience that you have there. I think a lot of us know, right off the bat, as we're looking with this, is that data breaches are occurring all the time. I don't think I have to sell any of you on that. I think you can pick up the newspaper any given day. Frankly, most newspapers are just tired of reporting on it these days. So you can go to places like privacyrights.org or some of the IC3 databases or some of these, and see some of the database, or I'm sorry, some of the breaches that are taking place. And the bottom line is senior leadership doesn't want to be that next breach. It's not so much that they don't want to be in the front page of the paper, but they don't want that embarrassment. They don't want to have to respond. They don't want to have to deal with fire drills. They don't want to have to explain to shareholders that they were the ones that allowed this to happen. They don't want there to feel like there's custodial neglect taking place on behalf of organizations leadership. And honestly, there's a little bit of fear that took place. Some of you may remember when Target had their data breach, there was some fear that the senior leadership team, the board of directors at Target, were actually personally sued for responsibility for that breach. And I think it woke up a lot of board of directors, especially to say, wait a minute, even though the board of directors wasn't held liable, and it was clear that it was the organization's responsibility, not the personal responsibility of the board to deal with these issues, there still was this sense, I think, that there was a concern that may happen one day. And even if it's not a legal liability issue, there was just a sense that they should be more active, more aware of the issues that are in place there. And as much as they don't want to be the next breach, though, the reality is this topic is one of many, dozens, that they have to deal with on a regular basis. And I think all of us are very well aware this is not their primary focus. They have to keep the lights on. They've got to be able to pay employees. You look at something like the pandemic that's going on, around the world today, and as you look at that, you'll see, I mean, again, senior leadership teams are just as excited about keeping the lights on, about keeping employees in place, not having to furlough, lay people off. Those are the things that keep them up at night, maybe more so even than the breach issues that we're talking about here. So it's something we still have to make sure that we're effectively communicating and bringing some discipline around. And the part of this challenge is, too, that we're finding is that, frankly, frankly, as long as we've been talking about risk, the reality is that risk as a discipline is frankly, it's immature, it's relatively subjective. I find that even as we're working with clients, there's a lot of work that's evolving, a lot of things that we're having to define that we would have hoped were already in place, that the industry had already agreed upon, but frankly isn't always there. And I think if you look at most senior leadership teams, there's maybe this perspective years ago that senior leadership just wanted to be as cheap as possible and didn't really care about these sort of things. But I'll tell you, every board of directors that I've spoken to in the last maybe 5 or 10 years honestly cared what I had to say. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to allocate all their resources to making this thing possible, but they did care. And so they don't want to be excessive, right? They don't want to gold plate what's going on. They don't want to do more than they have to, but they do want to know what they need to do to be effective, to have cyber hygiene principles. And honestly, if you put yourself in their shoes, it's really unclear to most of them what you have to do to defend themselves. And in most cases, they don't really know if they're doing those things or not. The best analogy I sometimes have is it's like taking your car to the mechanic when you have no idea how to fix a car. And you drive your car in, you say, listen, there's a noise in the engine. I don't understand it. I don't know what's going on. I just know that there's a noise. I'm just concerned that something doesn't feel right. And the mechanic tells you, you know what, for $1,000, $2,000, we can definitely fix that. And you feel like you're at their mercy. And you don't know what they're saying is accurate or not, but you just say, okay, just, please don't let it cost too much and please make the noise go away. And that's very much where a lot of senior executives are today. They don't always understand the conversation, but they know they need to do something, but they don't want to be doing more than they need to. It's very, very similar in what we're trying to see there with that mechanic example. One of the resources I want to give you just immediately right away as we talk about this is I think there was a great presentation back in 2017 that Alan Poller and John Pescatore of SANS did about really talking about the mindset of senior leadership and what they're expecting and what they're looking for from you, the people that are reporting to them. I don't want to refresh that. I don't want to rehash and go through all the things that Alan and John talked about in that presentation. It's a wonderful presentation. I would recommend you look at it. It's one of the SANS webcasts. Normally I would save these to the very end of the talk, but in this case, I just want to go ahead and call this out right away. If this isn't already something you've listened to, or maybe it's been a few years since you took a listen, take a couple minutes and listen to it in the next week or two. I think it's definitely worth your time. And it talks about how do you influence CEOs, boards of directors, and it's a good precursor to some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today. So whereas this talks about the mindset, we're going to talk a little bit more about the practicality and how you actually pull this off. So again, just make sure that's one of your references. We're going to reference that a couple times here as we go through the presentation today. But the one thing, I guess, before we go on, I guess to summarize from this presentation that I would want to make sure you take away before we go on to the next section is that to really summarize this, what senior leadership wants is to know that they have a trustworthy team that's effectively defending their information systems. Or said a different way, they want to know that they can trust you. And as long as they're confident in you, that you have their backs, that you're watching out for them, that you're a trusted resource, you're going to get a lot of points and you're going to have the ability to influence the direction that the board senior leadership is going. Again, as long as you can maintain that trust. And again, it's that same mechanics example. You don't necessarily understand it, but you want to trust the mechanic you go to and know that they have your back. And that's the same thing leadership wants from you. So to start the conversation, I think we have to start all the way at the beginning. And I'll do this quickly because I know we only have so much time today. But the reality is I think we need to define our terms. I don't know that we all agree or know what we mean when we use certain terms. And the biggest one of those I'm going to say is risk itself. We use that term for so many different things that unfortunately, I think if I were to use it in a particular context and use that as a word, you may do the same thing, but have a completely different context. And now we mean completely different things. But because so many of us throw this word around, we use that so often, leadership teams have picked up on it, technical teams have picked up on it, but we don't necessarily know what it means. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where I ask people, should you do this really good thing? Like, should you be patching your system? Should you be, deploying configuration baselines or whatever it might be? And the response I get in these meetings is, well, I guess it really depends on the risk. And I want to scream when I hear that in meetings, because I want to say to the people who say it to me is, what do you mean when you say that? Because I think unfortunately we've been so conditioned to say those things. We can say them and there's some truth to it, but because we don't know what it means, it doesn't go anywhere. It's not actionable anymore. And so before you can present any of this to senior leadership, you need to know what it is you're presenting on, and you've got to have that scope. You can see just a couple examples on the screen. These are just a few. Sometimes when we talk about risk, we're talking about the idea of third-party risk. In other words, dealing with some of our business partners. Sometimes we're doing this, we say, well, it's a risk-based decision, and what we mean is we're trying to decide what good things we should be doing to defend ourselves. It's really risk for the purpose of control selection, but we're trying to decide what good things should we do. Sometimes people talk about risk and they're talking about who are the bad guys who are trying to attack them, sort of the spy stories and what's FBI saying this month, and who are the bad guys in different countries who might be sending attacks to our firewalls, that kind of thing. But sometimes that's what we're talking about. Sometimes it's the activities themselves. Sometimes it's the risk of something occurring. We're afraid of the consequences. There's so many different forms of this. And so when I hear people talk about risk, I almost always immediately want to respond, what do you mean when you say that? In fact, I really do believe, and you see that first bullet point on the slide, I really do believe that I think we want to consider taking that word risk out of our vocabulary. If you're talking about threat, then talk about threat. If you're talking about control selection, then talk about control selection. If you're talking about whether your business partners have implemented controls, then talk about whether your business partners have implemented controls or not. But let's be specific. And it's actually, I think you'll find yourself it's an interesting exercise. If every time you go to say the word risk, decide not to. And just make that a goal for the next month or maybe 3 months. Every time you're about to say the word risk, don't say the word risk and say something more specific instead. And see how that changes your language and forces you to be more precise about the way that you communicate with the people around you. I think you'll be surprised what a challenging exercise it actually is. So again, I'll throw that out to you to consider that. Now, regardless of how we're going to look at this, there's a bunch of different elements that we need to consider. If we're going to be communicating risk to leadership, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of narrow you in a little bit here, because again, having done this for a while, I think I can probably share with you what they're looking for and what they're expecting to hear. And if we're talking about risk in this context of being able to present it to leadership teams, what we're generally thinking about is just a few elements that we would generally want to consider. The biggest two that we're going to talk about are, first of all, going to be threats, which I'll define for you a little more detail here in a minute. So we're going to talk about threat as an element of risk, and we're going to talk about controls as an element of risk. And sometimes if you go to places like NIST and other places, sometimes they like to use the word safeguards as opposed to controls. I see a lot of people using those words interchangeably, and I know some people argue about that, but I'm not going to engage that argument today. For the sake of this conversation, we're just going to basically call controls and safeguards roughly the same thing. Also, people like to include things like vulnerabilities. And I think a lot of you probably for your CISSP exams or CISA exams or some of the GX stuff, you probably had to memorize something to the effect of, threat combined with vulnerability combined with impact or something like that yields risk. And that's fine and all. But in most cases, when I'm dealing with organizations, the practicality of dealing with issues like vulnerabilities, to be honest, is way above the scope of what most people can handle. It's not to say that it's not a part of risk. Certainly it's something to consider, but when it comes to practically putting this as a part of your risk conversations, I'll be honest, most people don't know what to do with it. And it's sort of, this is the masterclass version of risk, where, and most of us just are not in that place today. And by most, I mean like 99+% of organizations really aren't in that place yet. In addition to that, the other thing I put in here, I didn't put on the screen, but likelihood as well. I know it's another word a lot of times we put into there. I can tell you for the sake of this presentation, you hear me talking about this, I put likelihood as a portion of threat. And you'll see why I do that here in just a minute when I show you a diagram. Other times also we'll talk about things like assets value or criticality. And again, I put that as a secondary consideration only because with most of us, the way our networks are designed today, when everybody on the network can ping everybody else on the network, if you have a low classification or low value system that has low value or low level of safeguards or controls protecting that system, and that system gets compromised, it can be used to compromise your high value systems. And so without that network segmentation in place that most of us frankly just don't have, I don't know that asset value and criticality is nearly as important as a topic as we like to think it is. I think in theory it sounds great, but in practice, I don't know that it brings us as much value as we might consider. Therefore, again, threat and safeguards or threats and controls really are that core piece of what we want to think about. And if you look at this, sort of we have a simplified approach for this, and we're in the process. This is sort of this is a risk model. You might say, okay, well, James, what model is this? Is this Octave? Is this Tarala or any of those kind of models? And what it is you're going to see elements of all those elements of Tarala, elements of Octave, element of 830 and 39 and 37 and things like that sort of in here. But about a year ago, we ended up building a new risk model that really was trying to make this more practical. And you'll actually see later this year, we've been putting it through some drafting processes and getting people's feedback on it. We'll actually be releasing it as an official model probably at the end of the summer. But you can see here really what we've come up with and sort of what we do when we describe risk is we're looking at this from 2 points of view. On the right-hand side, we see risk assessment for the purpose of control selection. In other words, there's a whole set of activities that we're going to do, and we're going to do these activities purposely to make sure that we've chosen the appropriate controls that we believe we should be implementing in our organization. So how do we make those decisions? And that's what you're going to see on the right-hand side, those blue circles that you'll see over there on the right. On the left side, then, we also say we're going to do risk assessment for the purpose of gap analysis. And that's basically saying then, okay, we know what the good things are that we believe we should be doing, but are we doing the things that we think we should be doing? And that's what you're going to see there on the left side. And so those green circles that are there. And I bring this up this way because I think, first of all, we need to talk about risk in terms of buckets. We need to have an understanding of what are the major classifications of the way that we're going to do risk management. And I think a big part of this is we do risk management to decide what are the good things that we think we should be doing. Okay, that's what a lot of, frankly, traditional risk management is. It's that, how do I decide, do I need a web app firewall? Do I need to patch these systems? How quickly should I patch these systems? Do I need a, endpoint protection product, application control, or whatever it happens to be? How do I decide what I need? On the other hand, then, we have this idea of doing, once we've decided and know what good looks like, then we want to take steps to say, okay, once we know what good is, are we doing the things that we believe are good? The things that we said we know we should be doing, are we actually doing those things? And can we measure ourselves against that so that we know and can communicate to leadership teams, all right, we believe this is what we should be doing, okay, but are we actually doing it? Or this can be applied a lot of times to third parties as well. You say, these are the things that we believe third parties should be doing who are going to interact with our data sets, and now are they doing those things that we believe they should be doing? So we really view this as sort of two major buckets. Now, the reality is, though, most people aren't really doing what you see on the right-hand side. It's a great theory, and this sounds really good, but the reality is most of us don't actually do that. I'm going to come back to that here in just a minute. We're going to walk through that here in just a second. But when we do this for the purpose of control selection, what you'll see is we start with a threat inventory. We try to understand what are the things that could happen to us, right? Those things that could potentially cause us harm. We model those threats to try to figure out and prioritize those threats and figure out what are the threats that we really need to most be concerned with. Then as a separate step, we go ahead and define what are the controls we could possibly put in place to address the threats that we've identified there. And ideally, we're going to go ahead and put the two of those and line those up side by side and map those and map the threats that we have to the controls that we've identified. And so the idea is that as we look at prioritized threats and threats are mapped to controls, then what we could do is we should be able to prioritize the controls that are mapped to the higher likelihood threats. And so that leads to naturally this order of control prioritization so that we know what those things are that we should do. But in order to do this, what you have to do is you have to start by doing a threat inventory. And I know a lot of you, I can see a lot of familiar names sort of even asking questions already this morning, so it's great to see a lot of you here today. A lot of you know that we created something called the Open Threat Taxonomy. A lot of you know there's something out there called MITRE's ATT&CK model. So you know that there's these threat models that are out there that we can use, but you've either got to use one of those models or you've got to design your own inventory of here's all the bad things that could happen to us. And then from there, we've got to run that through a model that says, how do we prioritize those threats? And once we've done that, we can map that to controls that we think are appropriate. But the reality is that, again, very few organizations actually do that process. In fact, again, I've been doing a lot of this kind of consulting work for a lot of years now, and I can count on one hand the number of organizations that I know have actually gone through that right-hand side of the process. But we'll come back to that here in just a second. So if we're looking at this sort of at a high level then, and then trying to understand, what are those things that we should be looking at, then one of the first things we need to consider is what is the prioritized control library that we want to be able to present to senior leadership. So I know sort of that's background information, but I think we need to know that because if we don't clearly understand what our goals are and we don't know what that library looks like, how do we present to senior leadership teams what it is that they should or shouldn't be doing? So we have to start with that foundation. Once we know what the good things are and we agree on the good things we should be doing, then we can look at the organization in light of those controls. We can assess ourselves against that. We can do the gap analysis for the left side of the model that we showed earlier. And once we know that, now we have data to work with. We know what good is. We've measured ourselves in light of what we think good looks like. And now we can try to say, okay, in light of that, let's present what we believe is important to leadership so that they can handle that or address whatever goals we have. Now, part of that is we do have to identify who the appropriate stakeholders or the audience is that we're presenting to. I'm going to give you a couple options. This isn't always something that's going to be consistent. So you have to be specific, because depending on who that audience is, you're going to present this slightly differently. And I'll show you that here in a few minutes. Once we've identified who those stakeholders are, who the audience is that we're going to be presenting this to, we need to make sure we understand how to communicate control status, how to communicate events of interest, make sure that we can get that into the hands of leadership so they can make good decisions. And then optionally, if we are involved in the remediation cycle, we can talk a little bit more about recommending prioritized risk treatment plans or even tracking the status of those prioritized risk treatment plans. I know a lot of times with the consulting clients that I work with and dealing with security assessments, a lot of times they specifically will want to ask me, please, tell us specifically, give us a prioritized list, and then come back to us in 6 months and let's talk about that. But that's not always the case, right? Some of you may be in situations where that's really not appropriate. So in the cycle as a whole, somebody should be doing that, but that may or may not be your role. So again, that'll be sort of up in the air depending on what you see yourself doing within the organization. But let's look at these in a little more depth though. So first of all, like I said, in order to decide what controls you need to select, we have to make sure we understand what the threats are. And to define threat, I said I would do that. When we did the open threat taxonomy, we tried to keep this as simple as possible and debated this for quite some time, but we said to keep it simple, really we believe threats are anything with the potential to cause harm. And again, there's a lot of qualifiers that you put in there, loss or harm to information systems, those sort of things. But we wanted to keep it simple and straight to the point. So we said threats are anything with the potential to cause harm. And so by understanding these threats, what we can do, like I said, is we can map the threat to a control or a safeguard that we believe will make sure that that threat won't take place. And so specifically what you need from this is you'll need to have a library or an inventory of threats, and then some sort of weighting or prioritizing scale to be able to do threat modeling. And some of you have heard of like Microsoft Stride or Dread or some of those models that are out there. Adam Shostak, of course, has written a very popular book on threat modeling for this. So, some of those things would be the things we want to look at in order to help with that control prioritization process. Ultimately, though, this is going to go back, and we sort of looked at the taxonomies of these and tried to understand, where they fall back to. And as much as, we'd like there to be something complicated or newer or, something that you all didn't have to memorize as a part of all your intro to cybersecurity classes, the more we think about this, the more we believe that those three core tenets of information security, loss of confidentiality, loss of integrity, loss of availability, are still the main business drivers for why we're doing all the things that we're doing. Ultimately, we're concerned about credential stuffing. Ultimately, we're concerned about somebody doing privilege escalation or whatever it might be, because we're concerned that if they do, let's say, credential stuffing, that maybe we lose confidentiality of data. Now, I know it was trendy for a long time for people to create things like risk registers. And I'm not against risk registers, but I've seen companies go through and say, all right, we're going to lay out all the specific business risks that we're most concerned about. And it's an interesting exercise because it can help you understand your culture a little bit better and what are the things that are on your executives' minds. And it's never a bad idea to understand that sort of thing. But if we're doing comprehensive risk management, I don't know that it brings as much value as a lot of us like to think. In fact, it's sort of fallen out of favor the last few years, to be honest. And so instead, I think what we can see is that if we have a common company, right, with a flat network and a mix of Windows machines and Linux machines and a couple Mac desktops, right, all the things that you see in sort of the average business today. At the end of the day, if one of these threats is realized, what happens is the business will be impacted because we lose one of these three things. And again, any of these losses can ultimately cause harm to the business. And so we can get more specific than that if you want, but if people say, well, James, what do you mean loss of confidentiality? Confidentiality of what? And my response is typically anything that you have at your disposal that you're trying to keep private. If you allow these threats to take place, there's a good chance you're going to lose confidentiality of all of that. or the integrity of any of that data, because we oftentimes have these high walls around the perimeters, but we don't defend the inside. And as a result, that's the sort of scope we're talking about. We're talking about bringing this back to the business. So the reality is, though, again, before I go to this slide, let me just go back a little bit, just to go back to our model then. So if I look at that right-hand side, though, and a lot of you are thinking to yourselves, okay, wait a minute, James, I don't know that I'm actually doing any of those things on the right-hand side, or maybe I've dabbled in it a little bit, but I just don't have time to do that. Well, don't panic, because you're in the majority. Like I said, 99% plus of organizations, if not close to 100%, I mean, we're getting awfully close to 100% of companies, do not do the right side of this approach. And what we say is, we say, listen, we are busy. We have so much on our plate. We have so much to do. And frankly, this is the kind of thing that the industry should be doing as a whole rather than each company doing individually. So what we do is we want to be able to outsource. In other words, we want to be able to jump all the way to control prioritization, right? That fifth circle, and say, just somebody give me a list, give me a checklist, give me a list of prioritized controls, give me a framework, because I don't have time to do this. And so what happens is, what we do is we start looking at, okay, well, what are our options? And you see things, and many of you know that, I've been involved at the Center for Net Security for a lot of years, working with their CIS controls. So we have things like the CIS controls as a model. You have things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, version 1.1 is the most recent. 853, of course, is still talked about a lot. I'm getting a lot of conversations these days, the last year, about 800-171 and the corresponding CMMC documentation the Department of Defense is putting out. There's a lot of these kind of frameworks. And so a lot of people say, James, just listen, I don't have time for this. I'm going to outsource the right side. Just give me that prioritized list. Let me use that. And then I'll use that to go into the second phase, which is honestly perfectly fine. If that's what you believe is right, then do that. If you have the time and you can go through and show your work and do the right side, awesome. But if you want to rely on what the community has put together, don't feel bad about that, right? The focus is defending yourself, not necessarily reinventing and validating that what the industry as a whole has been saying is accurate. So if you don't have time for the right side, don't panic, right? Focus on one of these frameworks, move on with it. All right. At that point, though, once we've decided that this is what we believe is right, we need to understand, do we align with what we said is accurate? So when we were looking at these concepts of cyber hygiene, one of the things that there's a lady at Center for Net Security who's our CEO for a while. Her name was Jane Liu, and Jane was former Deputy Secretary over at Homeland Security. And when she came to CIS, one of the things she always would say to us is, she said, listen, I don't know a lot about necessarily all the technologies that we're talking about here in these projects, but she said, I do understand some of the basic principles involved. And she said, one of the concepts she said I understand from my dentist is the idea of hygiene. And she would say, I know I can go to my dentist, and I ask my dentist, what is dental hygiene? I know my dentist is basically going to tell me, I need to make sure I brush my teeth, I need to make sure I floss on a regular basis, and probably have regular dental checkups. And I've asked my dentist, hey, is there other things I should be doing, vitamins or fluoride treatments or other things like that? And a lot of times the dentist will say, listen, you can do that stuff, but at the end of the day, you really want to make sure that you have good teeth when you're old. Brush your teeth every day, floss on a regular basis, regular dental checkups. And that's the thing that, again, that's hygiene from a dental standpoint. And so once we know that, if we know what hygiene looks like, then we can look at ourselves in light of that principle and show senior leadership, listen, this is where we are. This is the basics that we've decided is right, but we have to know what good looks like first. Then the assessment phase is quality assurance. It's basically saying, are we doing the things that we said we're going to do? If we said to our dentist, listen, I need to floss, every couple of days, and our dentist says, well, listen, you come in for a checkup, hey, have you flossed? A lot of us are kind of shy and say, well, I probably should be doing it more, right, or something like that. Well, but if that's hygiene, then we need to be willing to do what hygiene is. And same for cybersecurity, right? If you know what hygiene looks like, then we need to do those. And if we're not doing those things, somebody needs to call us out on it, and we need to be able to figure out a plan for fixing that, for remediating that. And we need some sort of consistent methodology for tracking current status. And if you look at, okay, what are the tools that are out there and what are people actually using for this? There's basically two sets of tools that I see people using. By and large, the biggest tool people use to track this thing and go ahead and track and assess themselves is Excel. No doubt about it. I'll show you some examples here in just a minute. But more and more people are starting to consider some of the GRC engines as well, the governance risk compliance engines. And some of you are probably starting to talk about those in organizations. There's lots of those that are starting to be considered. And more this is moving more towards a business intelligence mindset, which we'll talk about here in just a second. One of the tools, and I think a lot of you, again, just seeing a lot of your names in the webcast, it's good to see a lot of former students and stuff here, and a lot of you have seen me display some of these tools. This is one of the Excel tools that we give away to people that's really looking at the Center for Net Security CIS controls and helping you measure yourself in light of those. And this is actually the results of an assessment that we had done probably a couple of years ago. And if, of course, this is a screenshot from version 6, but version 7.1 is what you'll see up on the website today. But basically what we've done is we've simply used Excel with a series of drop-down menus and a series of questions where you can go through this list of questions and say, okay, am I doing this, yes or no? Am I doing this to what degree? Am I automating this? And you can sort of answer questions for yourself like this. And this kind of approach is very popular. You can certainly design your own. If you don't want to be bothered to design your own, you just want to use things that other people are using. We've actually published this over at auditscripts.com. It's a free download for everybody. And the idea is that you can go through this and understand where are your risks. And then if you talk to other people in the community who are using the same tool, and I can tell you by looking at our weblogs, we have thousands of people a year who download the tool. There's a lot of people who can share their results with you. And that way, that can be something you can use for benchmarking or other things as well. So a lot of people are using Excel tools like this to help measure themselves. But if this is what you're going to do, pick one, pick a tool, make your own, and be consistent with it. You're going to also see companies, though, moving past this who want to do more than just that simple Excel approach and want to move on to some of the GRCs. One of the popular ones, of course, I know a lot of you are using ServiceNow. ServiceNow, of course, has that GRC module. Okay, this gets into the commercial world, of course. And I don't want to be just a shill for some of the vendors, but I will say there's a couple vendors that I see a lot. The GRC module in ServiceNow is definitely one of them. And the idea on the right, and it's kind of hard to see here, but if you've worked with these before, you probably know what I'm talking about. But you have the ability to fill in this database-based model as opposed to the spreadsheet-based model we saw back with Excel, and then provide more of a real-time basis for reporting that risk. We can even talk about connecting these tools back to other existing instrumentation we have, like anti-malware consoles or other endpoint protection suites, SIMs, et cetera, Active Directory, whatever it might be, to pull in data to go ahead and report where risk may reside. Same is true for Archer. I know a lot of the federal government has been using Archer. Center for Net Security just stood up an Archer instance for a standardized questionnaire for states and municipalities. And again, you're seeing some private sector organizations as well. But again, it's yet another tool to do exactly what we just saw with ServiceNow. A lot of that same functionality built into it as well inside of SmartSuite. There's other ones that are out there. Some of you have looked at things like Aramba, which is a German company, an open source tool for GRC. Seeing some people using more and more of the KnowBe4 toolkit, which is a free GRC if you have the KnowBe4 subscription. So there's a bunch of different tools like that are out there, LogicGate or RSAM or whatever ones you may be looking at. Not all of them are created equal, but again, all of them have some methodologies you can use to record, are you doing the things that you said you would do? So again, if I just go back here, let's say over to the Excel tool, you can keep it as simple as using something like Excel and saying, okay, here's a list of the questions that I want to ask myself. Am I doing these things? And so we've got that inside of this Excel tool and we can answer those questions. Or you can put it inside of a database and use something like ServiceNow, use something like KnowBe4, or whatever it is that you feel like is appropriate for your organization. But one way or another, use a tool and use it consistently, because you're educating people not only on the risk methodologies that you're following, but you're educating people on how to interpret these results. So you see a graph in ServiceNow, okay, great, what does that mean? How does senior leadership know that this is something that we need to be concerned about? So anyway, it's just something that we want to make sure that you're keeping consistent so that they learn both the methodology and how to interpret the results. Now, the other thing that I know, we're starting to gather this information. This is obviously all data that we're going to be presenting to leadership teams. The other thing that I know a lot of people want to be able to talk about is not just control-centric risk. In other words, if we believe, for example, that application control is important and all of our endpoints need application control, which, by the way, I would highly, highly encourage, then we want to be able to measure ourselves, right? Control-oriented risk assessment says we want to be able to say, all right, if we believe application control is important and we've got 10,000 machines in our organization, how many of those machines actually have application control in place? How many of them have the carbon black agent running? And so we can say, okay, what is that number? And then come up with a percent. We can say, okay, not only how many of them have the service running and have the client installed, but how many of them are in high enforcement mode, right? So it actually blocks binaries that aren't appropriate. But we can start to look at those those things and make sure that we're comfortable that we're meeting the control objectives that we set for ourselves. But not all of the things that a lot of organizations want to communicate is control oriented. So a lot of folks also, I've noticed, when they're putting together their first metrics and what they want to share with leadership teams, they start with event oriented metrics. And there's nothing wrong with it as long as we know why we're doing it. And you can see some examples of things that you might see here. Probably one of the most popular ones that I see is common vulnerability scoring system scores, right? In other words, the result from your vulnerability scanner. So you might share the results of Nessus, or you might share the results of Rapid7, or some of these tools with leadership teams. Or a lot of people will share, how many incidents have been reported in the last X number of months, or how many detection events have you discovered in your SIM for whatever instance, something that's important to you. Maybe there's availability metrics that you share. And you can do all those things, right? I'm not against it. But whether you're showing control-oriented risk values or you're showing event-oriented risk values, my question for you is, what do you expect senior leadership to do when they have that information? And I'll give you an example. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was talking with a CEO for a company I was doing an assessment for. And he knew I was on site. This is all pre-COVID and everything. And I was on site, happened to be working with their audit team. And so he knew I was in the building, and he said, listen, if you have a half hour, come by my office. I got a couple questions for you. So CEO made a couple minutes for me. I went over and spent some time with him. And he said, listen, one of my big concerns is I get all this data from my IT teams and from my security team, but I don't know what it means. And he said, for example, and he actually pulled out a vulnerability scan report, and it was just basically month by month, and it was how many criticals, how many highs, how many mediums, how many lows, right? But it was month by month, this bar graph, and it showed how people have been in progression. And it says, so here I've got like 30, 40,000 issues that show up on this chart, and it seems to be trending down and staying roughly stable. He said, but what do I do with this? He said, what am I supposed to understand? And so we took some time and I walked him through it. But at the end of the day, honestly, it wasn't data that was meaningful to him. And so again, I'm not opposed to people sharing that kind of information, but I want to know that you have a reason for what you're doing. Why are you sharing that information? What do you hope to get out of that? Because again, you have a very small window, a very small focus or time to get their focus and attention. We've got to be able to optimize that. So make sure you're careful about this. What I tell most companies is start with the things that you can get the biggest impact on first. And in my opinion, in most cases, that tends to be control-oriented risk conversations. What are the things we're doing? What are the things we're not doing? Because at the end of that conversation, a leadership team can say, wait a minute, you mean we're not doing the thing we said we were going to do in these instances over here? Well, make that right? Go out, you have our backing, go to that department, tell them that they need to do these things. And now you've got action, right? Now you can come back in another 3 months and report, the progress that you made. But if I share CVSS data, it's awesome, right? I love metrics or stuff like that. But does it really give me actionable items other than the CEO saying, well, just fix those? And maybe that's valuable, right? Maybe that's something that we can consider. But we'll talk about that just more in a second here. So now that you have this data, so let's say you have it, right? So let's say you've gone through this process and you have control-oriented data, you have some event-oriented data, you've decided the story that you want to tell. Figure out who you're giving this information to. We can give this information to board of directors. We can give it to C-level individuals. We can give it to technical teams, operational teams. But I'll be honest, depending on who you share this information with, you're going to find that you're going to want to present it in different ways and with different goals in mind. Ultimately, you want this risk data in the hands of the data stakeholders. Whoever those stakeholders are, you want them to have this information. And if you look at some of the, you look at Hubbard or you read some of those books that are out there, Hubbard will say that we quantify this risk information, we quantify things, we measure things in order to make better decisions. And so if we're doing this to make better decisions, well, then we want to put the data in the hands of stakeholders who are the people making the decisions so that they can use this effectively. And so you say, okay, well, who are the stakeholders? Well, again, from one of those famous texts, right, the PMBOK, right, the Project Management Body of Knowledge, PMBOK says that stakeholders are an individual, group, or organization who may be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of the project. So we're thinking things here like data owners, data custodians, senior leadership teams, boards of directors, right? These can all potentially fall into those categories. And I'm going to argue that there's different stakeholder groups that we most often run into. And these are probably some of the ones that I would most likely see as I would go to talk to a company like yours. And what I see is that there's the business leadership side, and there's the operational management side. And even if we just look at that designation or that differentiation to start, what you're going to find is there's going to be a common difference in the way that we present. With business leadership tends to want to know, are we moving forward? Are we making progress? Are we doing due diligence, right? They want to know that we've got that standard of due care and we're doing what needs to be done, but they don't necessarily know the details. It said again, go back to the mechanic example. Those people in the top part, or the top groups, they want to know that we have a plan, that we're moving towards that plan, that we're making progress. That's the thing that they care about. On the other hand, the operational management folks, the technical stakeholders, they're much more engaged in the actual details. Does that control make sense? Is that control going to do what you say it's going to do? Should I prioritize control A over control B? Those are the kinds of conversations you'll have at that other layer there. So you need to start this, who is it, which side of this are you really presenting to? Because the message is going to be different. Obviously, one is much more business focused, one is going to be much more high level, one is going to be more progress oriented, the other is going to be more focused on the technical, the tactical, how do we achieve these results in the time period we've identified. Now, as we get into these and talk about this, let's focus on the senior side. So again, the focus of this presentation is really the top half. When I'm looking at the bottom half of the group there, again, the operational teams, these are teams where honestly, you might spend hours or days or weeks just talking about, what you've learned and how to remediate and, the devil in the details kind of thing. And so that's something that's going to be sort of a black hole, but a good black hole, right? The kind of thing that you want to spend lots of time. When I'm doing assessments, I know I always want to spend lots of time with the bottom half of the group because they're the ones who are going to make things happen. But the focus of this webcast is really talking about the top half, right? Boards of directors, C-suite, how do we communicate with them? And at the end of the day, like I said earlier, they want to be apprised of the current state of the union. They want to know, where are we today? They want to know, how can I help you make sure this happens, right? It's said a different way, right? They want to know they've got a guide, they've got somebody in the company, that there's a team of people, that there's an effective team, that they're going to make good decisions to help achieve these goals that we've set for ourselves. And that's ultimately what they're really hoping for. And so if, again, we talk to those folks and we say, all right, they're not looking for weekly reports. Okay, they're not looking for you to get into details. They don't care what tool you buy. They just want to know that you're making progress and doing the thing that you said you were going to do. And so normally these are the conversations we have in boards of director meetings, formal leadership committee meetings, tactical committees maybe, but mostly it's those first two. And so a couple of things to think about. So if you're having these presentations, what are the kinds of conversations you're going to want to have? So let's say that your responsibility is in a month, you have to give this kind of talk. What would you put into the presentation? So there's a couple of things that generally people want to know about. One of the things that I generally see people want to know is, are we under attack? You always hear that conversation. People say, we're not the NSA, we're not Fort Knox, we're not whoever, right? Whoever they believe to sort of be the high value target, we're not a bank, right? Or something like that. But they want to know, are we actually under attack, or is this just something that we see in the news? So I think part of the conversation you can have is help them understand, listen, we are impacted by this. I think one of the reasons people will actually share incident data with leadership teams is to help the leadership teams understand that these bad things are happening to us, not just to people on the news and the internet. And so I think that level of security awareness is a good thing to communicate. You want to temper that, right? You don't want to spend all your time talking about that unless you're really just doing a security awareness exercise. But you want to give just a little bit of time to remind them, hey, listen, this isn't just in the newspapers, this affects us. And I think that's a good message to get across. The other thing that they're going to ask a lot is, are we doing enough to defend ourselves? And again, they want to know. I literally heard this from a board of directors in North Carolina a few years ago. They literally asked me, listen, are we doing enough? How do we compare to other companies like us? Because, if there's a bear in the woods, I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than my friend, right? And so I literally heard that in a board of directors meeting. And of course, my response to them was, well, unfortunately, there's lots of bears in this particular set of woods. But they want to know, right? Are we doing enough to defend ourselves? Doesn't have to be perfect, but they want to know, are we doing enough? And they want to know how we compare to other companies like us. They want that elusive benchmarking data. And not to burst anyone's bubble, I think the more you do this, you can give sort of mostly subjective benchmarking, but anybody who's promising you truly objective quantifiable benchmarking, isn't being objective with you. There is no massive, wonderful database that we've all agreed to that stores this information that we can pull from. I'd love to have that. I think we all would, but the reality is it just doesn't exist today. We can give a qualitative or sort of a high-level view of things, general, sort of paint general pictures here, but getting to that really detailed level, like you'd see the insurance industry do, we're just not there. The other thing is they'll often ask, what's the status of these implementation efforts that we have in place? You said last quarter that you were working on these 5 initiatives. How are those going? And so they're going to know that you're making progress. They don't need to know what it are. They need to know what the Canuter valve does. They just need to know that it's working now. And so they're going to ask you questions along those lines. But at the end of the day, they're going to look at you as a subject matter expert. So don't be afraid to give them advice, talk about specific ideas that you guys are implementing that the team has agreed to. But at the end of the day, remember that the risk for all of this falls on their shoulders. And that's an important consideration. And a lot of you have heard me say this before, and I always tell people, right, there's not many slides where I put all bold red text, right? And if it feels like I'm screaming at you, it probably should. Because if I could give you one thing, one message to take away from webcasts like this, one just thing that sticks in your head, it is not your job as a cybersecurity professional to sell stakeholders on security. And I liken this to a CFO. Imagine you're a chief financial officer and your CEO, your board of directors comes to you and says, CFO, are we making money this quarter or are we losing money this quarter? And the CFO says, well, unfortunately, we're losing money this quarter. And the board says, oh, okay, no big deal. And the CFO says, well, wait a minute, we're losing money. You don't understand, that's bad. We shouldn't be losing money. And the board says, oh, whatever, we're losing money. Who cares? We're just losing money. It's not the CFO's job to convince a board of directors that you shouldn't be losing money, right? That's the importance of being on a board. You've got to have a certain skill set to be there. And if you're in that position of leadership and you don't believe security is important, it's not your job as a security professional to take on that risk. Now, don't get me wrong, right? You can encourage, you can try to do awareness, you can try to change culture, but at the end of the day, it is not your responsibility. It's your job to present risk to allow stakeholders to make informed decisions. Give them the data that we've just been talking about, let them see what that information is, and then make better decisions on that. Now they're going to come to you, right? You're the subject matter expert. They're going to want to hear what you have to say, and that's perfectly fine. But at the end of the day, though, it is not your job to make these decisions. We want to help them. We want to assist them. It's almost like we're all internal consultants to our own teams, and we want to advise them. We want to give them good advice. We want to help them make good decisions. But at the end of the day, the choice is theirs. And that's the important thing to remember. The choice ultimately is going to be theirs, how they respond to the risk that you've put in place. If you say, boss, we need application control, right? We need $100,000 to go ahead and put the solution across all of our systems. Can you please budget for it? And they say, well, we just don't really see that that's all that important. Well, do your best, right? Try to convince them, show them proof of concepts, bring in pen testers, right? Everything you got to do to go ahead and validate that what you're saying is right. But at the end of the day, if they don't believe you, they don't believe you. And that's a situation you're going to have to agree to. It's their organization. What do you always hear, right? Everything rises and falls on leadership. And that's true for security as well. But when you do this, though, there's a couple of different ways generally we're going to be presenting this information to leadership. A lot of you are going to be doing this in written reports. Although I will say I see sort of the trend is external reviewers or assessors or people presenting risk tend to do more written reports. I wish internal people would do this more, but I also know it's time consuming and you guys have a lot on your plates. But written reports tend to be primarily done by external folks like myself, but I do think internal teams should consider them more. Most everybody is going to do oral presentations, right, where we talk about risk in front of these teams. And then, of course, a lot of us would love to move to a more real-time approach or dashboard approach where we're presenting this information in real time to leadership teams so they can look at it almost ad hoc or whenever they feel like it, in addition to the times we're giving more formal presentations. There is no right way to give these presentations, though. And so I don't want to give the idea that, you have to follow a particular formula. I mean, I can give you some tips, certainly for sure, to give you some ideas of where to start and everything. But really, when we're thinking about this, there is no right way. Every company has different culture and different norms that they're going to have to follow. So, for example, I was at a company in San Francisco, a more tech-oriented company. They said, listen, James, you're going to present to our board. You have 10 minutes. Do not use PowerPoint. They smell fear if you use PowerPoint. Do not use it. Other companies said, no, you absolutely have to use PowerPoint. It's got to be in our board minutes. We want to have a document that shares what you were talking about. So, complete polar opposites. And so every company's going to have things like that that are part of their norms. What I always recommend is start by documenting the risks that you've identified. Okay, be clear, write it out. Imagine you're writing this for the technical audience. Give the details. And so that way you can give them something that they can think about, you guys can talk through as a team, but you have the details for what you're hoping for. But then once you have the details written, then actually put the beginning of that written document in executive summary that summarizes the things you've put together. So you write the body of the report first, and then you're going to go back and write the executive summary based on what you put into the details there. And you can take data from some of your tools, your Excel worksheets, your GRC modules and things like that, and get those into your report. Nothing wrong with that. At the end of that report, you have basically two goals. You want to present data to the readers, if that's scores, if that's benchmarks, if it's the status of a project, whatever that might be, and then present clear recommendations, clear action items. Like, what do you hope the organization will do based on the risk that you've identified? Now, the bigger opportunity, I think, though, is the oral presentation. The written document's always going to be good. It's always going to be a leave behind, something you can track against. You can put into a project management office, right? All those good things. But especially with the senior teams, they have so much documentation they're expected to absorb. Getting their attention and helping them focus on the most important parts, to me, is where really you can shine. And so this is your chance for an understanding. So when you get this opportunity, give them the data, right? Give them the graphs, the charts, the executive summary, the full written report, give them everything. But then be clear and concise, and honestly, most important, confident when you're presenting this risk. If you're confident with that board, if you're confident with that senior leadership team, and you clearly then communicate what it is that you've learned from this assessment, then from there, they're going to trust you and you're going to become their trusted advisor. And that's what you're ultimately shooting for here. But like I said before, know what your goal is before you start presenting. Is your goal just to raise awareness? Let them know that scary things are out there in the world? Is your goal to get more budget? Is your goal to get more people? Is your goal to realign priorities, use existing resources to focus on specific controls? Right? What is it that you're giving this presentation for? The other thing that I always want to make sure people are thinking about is always leave time for questions and answer any question they ask, no matter how bizarre it might sound. I know when some of the tech executives sometimes go in front of Congress, you always hear sort of weird questions being asked, almost like the tech executives have become help support for the congressional representatives there in the committee. And people make fun of it, I know, and we laugh. But if you're in that situation, please, I beg you, answer their questions, because the subtext, the goal underneath all this is for you to become that trusted advisor. And if they say to you, boy, I know that this risk information is really interesting, but you know what, I've really been concerned about my home computer. My brother-in-law told me that I should be using this anti-malware, but I don't know, I was thinking about using this one. What do you think I should do? For goodness sake, answer the person's question. Because the more they talk to you in that meeting, the more they talk to you and engage you after the meeting, the more they just find you in a hallway, the more opportunities you have to present that cultural information, that risk information to them and raise their awareness. So please, no matter how bizarre the question, please take the time to answer it. But be realistic, you're not going to get a lot of time. What I find is with boards of directors, I typically get about 10 to 20 minutes annually. There are a couple situations where I'm given a little bit more. They tend to be smaller companies, a couple tech companies I know where the CEOs and the board is very tech oriented. And in some of those cases, I might get as much as an hour. But again, that's annually. But for most boards of directors, it's 10 to 20 minutes. The last year before the COVID, I know I had one talk in San Francisco and one in Chicago where I flew to the city. So I'm in Florida where I'm presenting from today, and flew from Florida to San Francisco, had lunch with the technical team. Right after lunch, gave my presentation for about 10 to 15 minutes. And at the end of the presentation, everybody said, thank you so much for coming out here. Thank you so much for presenting. And they put me back on the plane to go home. Same thing happened in Chicago last year. Had it happen to me twice. It's very, very normal. So they have a lot to talk about, and they don't meet that often, so you can't get a lot of time. That's very normal. Technical leadership committees, like I said, you can get a little bit more time with. And sometimes you might have a board representative there. A lot of times in your steering committees and such, you may have a little bit more. But normally you're still only going to get about 60 to 90 minutes. And even then, the most you're going to get is probably quarterly. And those tend to be more decision-making bodies. And you're probably not going to get that every quarter. But once in a while, you might get that. But that's still probably about the max you're going to get there. And then in the engineering committees, right, those technical staff, the technical teams we talked about, potentially you've got unlimited amounts of time with them. So, take advantage of that time, help them understand the details of the things that we've been talking about here. Eventually, what we hope all this goes to is what I mentioned earlier, is that business intelligence view of risk. And then that really is where we're hoping this is going to end up. And so what we're going to say is, eventually we want to formalize this process and really start taking the principles that we've learned from project management, from program management, groups like the Project Management Institute, business intelligence data sets or disciplines. I don't see a need for us to reinvent the wheel in security. If BI as a discipline already has principles, if program management already has principles we can rely on, why not co-opt that for ourselves? Why reinvent the wheel? So it seems to me that if we can clearly define controls, then that can lead to a clearly defined set of measures. Right? How we measure ourselves to see, are we doing the things we said were right? The more we agree on controls, the more we agree on measures. So as an industry, if we can agree on controls that we think are right, then we can agree on measures that we think are right. And in fact, that's something that we did with the CIS controls. And when we released version 7, we actually went through, and for every one of the 171 sub-control statements, we had a corresponding measure that people could use, because we wanted to make that easy for people. Once we have measures in place, we can automate the controls and measures via technical tools. And the more we automate that, the more we can get data from what we've done. The more we grab that data, individual measures can be aggregated to report risk in a more real-time or more continuous monitoring basis. And I think this is something that a lot of folks, as you hear words like continuous monitoring or continuous audit, or some of these words that are sort of out there in buzzwords right now, I think there's a lot we can learn from them, because I think eventually we are going to become more disciplined as a community. And the more we can define our controls, then the easier it is to define measures. The more we define measures and automate those measures, the more we can get leadership information on a more real-time basis to make better decisions. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. So I know we're running short on time. Ultimately, though, again, all responsibility for cybersecurity falls on senior leadership. These groups that we're talking to, it's important for us to be able to present to them because they're responsible for what we're saying. It's our job to effectively communicate risk so stakeholders can make better decisions. But don't accept risk that's not yours to accept. I've seen so many times where people go in front of these boards of directors and leadership teams and say, and here's the risk, and everyone gets concerned in the room, and you say, oh, well, let me take the pain and the sting of that away. It's really okay. Don't do that. Let the people responsible for the risk own the risk. Don't accept risk that's not yours to accept. And by not communicating, you're accepting that risk for them. You've got to give them the information so they can make better decisions. Practice communicating uncertainty via what we do know. We're not going to be perfect on this, but we know what cyber hygiene looks like. And if you can communicate where you stand on those hygiene principles, then we may be able to have a better chance of actually defend ourselves. But use that, embrace a partnership with these stakeholders. Don't own it, but help them to be better at every chance that you get. Don't make this adversarial. Don't make this you versus them. Partner with senior leadership. Partner with technical teams. We really want to be able to do as much as we can to go ahead and learn from each other and hopefully give them the tools that they need so as a whole we can defend ourselves better. Again, I know we're trying to do a lot in an hour. These webcasts are always just so full, it seems like to me. So I want to share a couple just other resources if you haven't seen these before. First of all, you do have my email address. I really do share this in every one of my presentations. I've been working with SANS for almost 20 years now, and I've given away this email a lot. And one of the things I know is that students have been really good and not abuse that. So as long as people don't abuse it, I'll keep giving it away. So the only thing I'd say is if you you have any questions for me or I can clarify anything after the webcast, just send me an email. And just mention that you talked to me in the webcast, or you listened to the webcast, or maybe you're listening to this a year from now or something. Just let me know where you heard the conversation so I can put some context around it. That would be very helpful. And there are a lot of other good resources out there I'd have you go to. I gave you that SANS webcast from Alan and John. If you haven't listened to that one, I would start with that. If you go to auditscripts.com, remember I told you there's a bunch of free resources there that we've been giving away to people, and these are things that we use in our practice. So things that we're constantly changing, constantly have new versions out there. As we put something out new for our clients, we're going to put it out for free on the site so you guys can use it too. A lot of the content that we're talking through here today in concept is also sort of gone into more detail. If you're interested in this kind of topic, we do have a couple courses at SANS that cover this. We've written the 415 class, a 2-day class to introduce cybersecurity risk management, and we also have the 5-day class on Security 566. Which is there to look at the critical controls themselves if you want to get more of the control side of things. So those might be additional resources you want to look at, and there's a lot of corresponding free resources out for both of those out there on the SANS site and at AuditScripts as well. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, as much as I'd love to answer questions, I think we may be sort of out of opportunities here to go through too many questions here. So I think what we're probably going to have to do is move a lot of these conversations over to email today. So again, the slides and the recording of the webcast are going to be available online if you want to listen to this again. And I would just ask, again, I just appreciate everybody's patience with us and just say that if you have the opportunity and you have questions, I see again, a lot of them have come in for sure. Just simply drop me an email and I'll see if I can't maybe answer some of those questions more specifically for you in the next couple days. Again, thanks for being here. Really appreciate being on the SANS webcast, and hopefully as the pandemic slows down and we can all be back in person together here soon, we'll get to see you at a conference here sometime in the near future. Thanks again for being here today.